What if the secret to becoming something more than human was written thousands of years ago? Imagine a book so powerful, ancient priests swore oaths to protect it with their lives. A text that speaks of energy, gods, and the forbidden blueprint of consciousness itself. You were never told that such a thing exists, but it does. They call it the Book of Thoth, and almost no one has read it completely. Most translations are missing pieces, hidden in secret orders and lost temples. This is a mythology, it's a manual for unlocking divine potential, and 99% of people will never see it. Not because it's impossible to find, but because they're not ready to understand it. But you are. This is your moment to question what you've always believed was reality. To awaken a power that was buried inside you long before you were born. But only if you're ready. What if the real danger of awakening wasn't failure, but success? For centuries, seekers have searched for the secrets hidden in the Book of Thoth, a text said to grant the wisdom of the gods. But there's a reason the ancient priests guarded it with blood oaths and not reverence. The book doesn't just teach, it tests. And most aren't ready for what it demands. It's not power that destroys the unprepared, but what comes after power. In 1912, the occultist Aleister Crowley hinted that certain pages of the book weren't translated for the sake of sanity. He wasn't exaggerating. Some initiates who attempted the full invocation reported episodes of ego dissolution so severe, they lost contact with consensus reality for days. This isn't myth. It's documented in letters, journals, and testimonies kept hidden in private archives. The psychiatrist Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." But the Book of Thoth does exactly that. It doesn't lead you to answers, it pushes you into your own unconscious and seals the door behind you. Some call it initiation, others call it ego death. But what happens there cannot be undone. And the line between enlightenment and madness is often drawn in silence. One man, a former member of the modern Hermetic order, shared online that after years of disciplined study, he began hearing phrases that weren't his during deep meditation. He stopped eating. He stopped recognizing his own name. It took 6 months of therapy before he could hold a conversation again. He said it wasn't demonic, it was like touching something older than humanity itself. And that's what the ancients feared, not evil, but truths too large for the mind to hold. Even neuroscience touches the edges of this phenomenon. Studies from the Beckley Foundation on high-dose meditative states show that the brain enters hyperconnectivity, blurring the self-other boundary. In spiritual traditions, this is transcendence. But to an unprepared psyche, it can feel like dissolution. Imagine the mirror shattering and realizing you were never the reflection to begin with. But here's the part no one talks about. The book doesn't destroy you. It simply shows you that you were never what you thought you were. And once that illusion crumbles, there's no safe way back. And it's precisely at that point that reality begins to unravel. Because the moment you step beyond the threshold, you no longer read the book. The book begins to read you. And what it reveals depends entirely on what you've been hiding. They told you reality is fixed, that what you see is what there is. But what if everything you've ever experienced was shaped not by matter, but by vibration? The Book of Thoth doesn't describe the world, it encodes a system for building it. And buried within its cryptic verses lies a formula so ancient, even modern physics is just beginning to catch up. The principle is disarmingly simple: frequency, intention, and silence. 3 forces that, when aligned, alter not just your perception of reality, but the structure of reality itself. According to quantum theorists like Dr. Amit Goswami, consciousness isn't a byproduct of matter, but the source of it. In this view, your thoughts don't just float in your head. They collapse possibilities into form. It sounds abstract until you realize this is exactly what Thoth described thousands of years ago without equations, but with symbols. In a series of translated fragments, Thoth speaks of tuning the soul to the pattern of divine rhythm. At first glance, it reads like poetry, but matched with Greg Braden's work on coherent heart-brain frequencies, it becomes eerily precise. The state of internal coherence, when your emotional and mental states vibrate in sync, produces a measurable electromagnetic signature. And in those moments, people report seeing patterns align around them. Unexpected phone calls, uncanny opportunities, perfect timing. Coincidence? Or code? At Princeton's Pear Lab, decades of experiments showed that human intention can subtly influence machines programmed to act randomly. The effect wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent. Small, statistically significant shifts suggesting that consciousness and matter aren't separate after all. Now imagine that amplified by spiritual discipline, emotional mastery, and the formulas of an ancient god. What kind of world would that level of coherence produce? There's a story circulating online, shared by a painter who began meditating with sound frequencies matching planetary orbits, while visualizing symbols drawn from Thoth's text. He claims his work changed overnight, not in style, but in impact. Viewers reported emotional reactions, dreams, even epiphanies just from seeing his paintings. He said, "It stopped being my art. I became a channel for something that already existed, waiting to be made visible." But here's what most people miss. The formula doesn't work like a machine. It doesn't obey you. It responds to your alignment. You can't fake silence. You can't force intention. And frequency, the most elusive of the three, isn't just sound, it's the emotional climate of your being. When those three conditions are met, something starts to shift. Not in theory, but in the air around you. And it's in that subtle shift that the real magic begins to ripple. What if the reality you wake up in tomorrow isn't something you entered, but something you unconsciously authored? What if you've been writing your life like a sentence on repeat, without ever realizing you were holding the pen all along? And what happens when you finally change the rhythm of the ink? Because Thoth didn't give us a spell. He gave us a structure, one that only reveals its truth when you stop trying to control the world and start resonating with it. Not to conquer it, but to harmonize with something that existed long before you had a name. There's a reason ancient temples were built to mirror the human body. A reason Egyptian initiates believed the soul didn't leave the body to ascend, it moved through it. In the cryptic writings attributed to Thoth, the body isn't a vessel to escape from. It's the first and last portal. And for those who understand how to activate it, the boundaries between worlds begin to thin. Thoth describes 7 gates aligned with the celestial forces, and modern translations often reduce this to symbolic metaphor. But when you align that description with the chakra system, the energy channels of Kundalini Yoga, and even recent findings in neuroanatomy, a different picture starts to form. A network of energy hubs vibrating in synchrony with universal forces, each connected not only to emotions, but to perception itself. This isn't mysticism, it's structure, and it's mapped into your skin. In the 1970s, Dr. John C. Lilly experimented with sensory deprivation and high-frequency meditation, claiming that certain vibrational states triggered sensations of travel within the body. Not movement in space, but transitions through states of being, gateways, as he called them. Tibetan monks speak of a similar process in Tummo meditation, where heat and light are generated from within. In both traditions, the body is not passive. It is a key waiting to turn. Thousands of accounts online describe spontaneous sensations during deep states of meditation, a rising energy, heat in the spine, flickers of geometric light behind closed eyes. One Reddit user detailed the sensation of being pulled upward by a rope inside my chest, followed by an overwhelming stillness. These aren't fantasies. They're consistent. And what they all suggest is this: something ancient is waking up inside us, and it speaks through vibration. Science is just beginning to catch traces of this. Studies on biofield energy and the vagus nerve suggest that emotional states aren't isolated in the brain. They radiate through the body and affect heart rate, immunity, even how we experience time. In the Book of Thoth, the phrase "as above, so below" isn't just cosmology, it's anatomy. The stars mirror the spine. The breath becomes a bridge, and consciousness becomes movement. But the most dangerous truth is this: the portal can be opened before you're ready to pass through. Once the energy rises, it doesn't ask for permission. And for those unprepared, it can cause vertigo, anxiety, even hallucinations. Not because something is going wrong, but because something unnatural is finally being undone. The body starts to remember a language older than thought, and it doesn't whisper. Imagine looking in the mirror and seeing your body not as flesh, but as architecture. Columns of light, resonant frequencies. You begin to realize you're not living in a body, you're living through one. And the further you go inward, the less the world outside seems stable. Because if the body is a portal, the question isn't what's inside you. The real question is, what's trying to come through? You were never meant to read the Book of Thoth in its entirety. Not because it's lost, but because parts of it have been deliberately held back. Some by secrecy, others by fear. There are pages, symbols, entire verses that simply don't appear in any public version. And the reason whispered through secret societies for centuries is chilling. Some truths are too dangerous to be spoken plainly. The 19th century mystic Eliphas Levi hinted at verses locked in iron silence, written not in letters, but in geometries only initiates could read. Aleister Crowley, who spent years decoding fragments of the book, published large portions but kept one chapter, handwritten and unnamed, sealed in his private vault until his death. He once wrote, "There are lines in this text which unhinge the soul." And he refused to say more. In a rare 2002 interview uncovered on a Cairo-based Arabic YouTube channel, Dr. Samir El-Sadi, an independent scholar and former museum linguist, stated that early versions of the text found near the Temple of Edfu were intentionally misfiled. Not because they were forged, he said, but because no one would translate what was in them without risking professional or spiritual collapse. He described verses that spoke of the chainless being, a force that moves through the reader if pronounced aloud. There are even records in the archives of the Rosicrucian Order AMWRC, only accessible through private membership, that suggest the Book of Thoth contains formulas meant not just to awaken higher faculties, but to override human will. In these restricted teachings, there's mention of a concept called the word of turning, a sound or vibration that once heard with inner clarity renders the ego permanently silent. The implications? Terrifying, even for seasoned initiates. And so the book was fragmented, edited, translated into symbolic decks like the tarot to mask its more volatile mechanics. The myth of its disappearance isn't true, it was simply disguised. But this raises the deeper question no one dares to ask out loud. Why would knowledge meant to awaken also be built to disarm the seeker? Who was Thoth really writing for? Humans or something else? Because the silence around these missing parts isn't just historical, it's strategic. The people who've glimpsed the full structure say it can act like a mirror turned inward, not reflecting your face, but your origin. And when the mirror reflects something the ego wasn't prepared to see, it doesn't crack, it dissolves. That's why so many walk away from this text with less certainty, not more. But what if that was the point? What if the missing verses aren't hidden to protect us, but to test who's ready to remember? No one told you that the energy shaping your reality isn't just in your thoughts or emotions, it's in your biology. More specifically, in the most misunderstood force you carry, your sexual energy. In the scattered verses of the Book of Thoth, there are veiled references to a rising fire, a current that moves upward through the body, awakening memory, vision, and creation itself. Not metaphorically, literally. Modern readers often skip those cryptic lines. They sound poetic, obscure, easy to dismiss. But initiates throughout history, from Egyptian priests to tantric monks, all pointed to the same phenomenon. When sexual energy is consciously directed instead of dispersed, it becomes the raw material of transformation. Not suppression, not indulgence, but transmutation. The ancient word for this power wasn't lust, it was life force. Thoth speaks of unifying the serpent and the sun, a symbol that echoes the Kundalini path of Eastern tradition, a coiled energy at the base of the spine, igniting inner fire as it ascends. And there's science catching up to it. In a 2018 study published in Frontiers in Psychology, researchers observed heightened levels of focus, motivation, and emotional balance in participants practicing sexual transmutation, redirecting sexual desire into creative tasks. But this isn't just productivity, it's identity being rewritten. One man, featured on the Brazilian channel Esoterismo na Prática, shared how he stopped watching explicit content and began combining breath work, visualization, and recitations inspired by Thoth's invocations. Within months, his life began shifting in subtle yet irreversible ways. Stronger intuition, strange dreams, and what he called timing that defied logic. He said, "It was like I stopped leaking energy and started creating with it." But there's a reason this teaching stays hidden. Because in a world that profits from distraction and indulgence, the idea that your most primal energy can be refined into spiritual clarity is a quiet rebellion. And more than that, it's a threat. A being who knows how to store energy is a being that no longer needs permission to evolve. And that kind of power doesn't obey systems. So the question becomes, what happens when you stop chasing release and start building inner voltage? When you hold the energy long enough for it to take shape, what kind of being are you becoming? And what ancient intelligence might be waiting at the top of that current? Because Thoth never said the gods gave you power. He said they hid it inside you. And once you stop giving it away, it starts to remember where it came from. You've been told that change comes slowly. That transformation is a long path, paved with effort and years of trial. But what if your identity isn't solid, just a pattern echoing inside the subconscious, waiting to be rewritten? The Book of Thoth doesn't describe the self as a fixed thing. It describes it as layered gates, each one protecting or imprisoning a deeper truth. And those who've passed through them report that the person they thought they were was only a mask. In one lesser-known translation of the Emerald Tablets, Thoth speaks of 12 forms that guard the light within. To most, this sounds like myth. But when you compare this with Jung's model of the unconscious, especially his theory of archetypes, a strange alignment appears. These forms resemble not just psychological roles, but emotional filters, patterns that distort how we see the world and how the world sees us. Each gate, a blind spot. And every blind spot is a choice you've forgotten you're making. Contemporary therapists working with archetypal regression often report that clients begin to access memories and emotions that don't match their current identity. They speak of feeling split, but in that fracture, something awakens. One study in Transpersonal Psychology Review described how certain visualizations, especially those involving ancient symbols and guided journeys, led patients to sudden cognitive shifts, as if a gate had opened and with it a new lens on life. There's a real story from a Lithuanian woman who shared, in a translated podcast interview, how she overcame years of emotional numbness using techniques based on the tablets. With the help of a spiritual therapist, she created visual doorways linked to key life memories and internal archetypes. Over several weeks, her dreams began to shift. She started waking up crying, not in sadness, but in relief. She said, "I realized the person I had been for 40 years was only one voice in a room of 12, and the others had been waiting patiently to speak." Thoth warned that these gates don't open with force, they open with resonance. You don't break through them, you tune yourself to them. And when you do, a memory deeper than memory stirs inside. These aren't just traumas or mental blocks. They are energetic patterns coded into your soul's structure, built over lifetimes, perhaps longer. And behind each one is a fragment of the self you've forgotten how to be. But once the gates begin to open, things do not stay still. Dreams become messages. Old habits vanish without effort. Relationships either deepen or dissolve, and your perception begins to operate outside linear thought. Time doesn't feel the same. The mind starts listening to something beneath words, something that sounds less like a voice and more like a frequency remembering its shape. And that's when the real mystery begins, because the final gate doesn't lead inward, it leads elsewhere. And whatever waits beyond that last threshold is not shaped by language or thought or time. You've been raised to believe that time is a river, that it flows forward second by second, and that your life is a fragile raft drifting along. But what if time is not linear at all? What if it loops, bends, folds inward? In the Book of Thoth, time is never treated as a fixed direction. It's spoken of as a veil, thin, manipulable, and often deceptive. And for those who learn to move through it, something strange begins to happen. The past and future stop being distant and start becoming accessible. In Tablet 3, Thoth writes of cycles within cycles, and a law beyond time that governs time itself. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as poetic cosmology. But when you align this with Friedrich Nietzsche's theory of the eternal return, the idea that all events happen again and again in an infinite loop, the meaning sharpens. And not just in philosophy. Neurological studies on states of flow and altered consciousness reveal that, under certain conditions, the brain loses its sense of sequence entirely. Events become now. Moments collapse into presence. In a recent study by Dr. Arne Dietrich, it was shown that during intense creative or meditative states, the brain reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for self-awareness and, critically, time perception. In that state, people report something uncanny. They feel outside of time. Not as an idea, but as a real sensation. Athletes call it the zone. Monks call it non-dual awareness. But in Thoth's language, it's something more deliberate, a doorway into timelessness. There's a story shared on the YouTube channel Mort Lucida of a former inmate in Sao Paulo who began practicing transcendental meditation in solitary confinement. With no clocks, no sunlight, and no markers of the day, he began to feel detached from all sense of duration. But what happened next was unexpected. He began recalling memories from childhood as if they were happening in that moment, and seeing flashes of future events that later played out in real life. He said, "Time stopped being real. I wasn't passing through time. It was passing through me." And here's where the book turns its blade. If time is not real, then what is age? What is waiting? What is death? In this frame, mortality becomes a function of perception, not biology. The more you believe in time's rule, the more you decay under it. But when you start to unhook your mind from the calendar, your consciousness begins to stretch. Memory becomes something more than a file cabinet. It becomes a portal, and that portal doesn't care how old you are. But the most disorienting truth comes when time no longer responds to you the way it used to. Synchronicities accelerate. Deja vu becomes persistent. You start to feel like you've been here before, because maybe you have. The boundaries between what's happened and what's coming begin to blur, until all that's left is this vibrating, eternal moment. And it's in that stillness that you finally realize. You were never in time. You were holding it. But now, it's starting to slip through your fingers. They told you to speak your truth, but never taught you how to listen to the words you write. The Book of Thoth is not a story, it's a pattern. A language meant to be read not just with the eyes, but with the nervous system. Hidden within its lines is a force the ancients called the living word, capable of awakening memory, shifting emotion, and rewiring perception. Not because of what the words mean, but because of how they vibrate. Modern psychology recognizes something similar. Dr. James Pennebaker, in his research at the University of Texas, discovered that expressive writing, putting raw emotion into structured language, can reduce trauma symptoms, improve immune function, and even alter brain chemistry. But what Thoth described goes far beyond therapy. In the Emerald Tablets, he speaks of carving truth into self through sound, suggesting that language, when spoken or written with resonance, becomes a spiritual technology. And what kind of language is this? Not literal, not poetic, symbolic. The ancient Egyptian glyphs were not just letters, they were frequencies in shape. Every curve, every line held intention. And when spoken aloud, these symbols activated parts of the psyche the rational mind could never access. This is why initiates didn't just study the book, they intoned it. They let the sound of the symbols reprogram the space around them and within. In a quiet testimony published on a healing blog by a former soldier, a man described how years of PTSD began to dissolve after weeks of writing down mantras inspired by Egyptian invocations. He didn't even understand the meaning at first. He just wrote over and over, letting the shapes and sounds take form. He said the words felt alive, that his hands trembled sometimes, and that he often cried without knowing why. It felt like something ancient was peeling off me. The act of writing then becomes something else. Not self-expression, but self-reconstruction. Not narrative, but transformation. You don't write to remember who you are. You write until something older remembers you. And in that space, the line between healing and magic becomes razor thin. Because the body responds. The breath deepens. Old pain rises and vanishes, as if the symbols have cut through time to rewrite the original wound. But the real secret lies not in what you write, but how long you stay silent after writing. Thoth warned of the space between symbols where the gods dwell. It's in the pause, the stillness after the word. That's where the shift happens. That's where language stops being communication and starts becoming code. Because once the symbols begin to echo through your nervous system, you don't just heal the past, you rewrite its meaning. And the version of you that emerges on the other side may not be the one that began. You've been led to believe that awakening is an ascent, a steady climb toward clarity, peace, and enlightenment. But the Book of Thoth tells a very different story. One not of ladders, but of labyrinths. In its hidden passages, it speaks of twists, echoes, false doors, and paths that circle back to the beginning. And it warns, the seeker who expects a straight line will walk in circles forever. In Tablet 9, Thoth describes a spiral within the soul, a turning that repeats, each time at a deeper level. Mystics across time have echoed this, from Dante's descent into 9 layers of the Inferno to the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, where ascent requires descent first. It's not poetic symbolism. It's a structure of consciousness. Real change doesn't go up. It goes in. And the deeper you go, the more disoriented you become. Not because you're lost, but because you're being unmade. Psychologists call this disorientation ego dissolution. According to research published in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, many who experience profound inner shifts first pass through a phase of psychological unraveling, confusion, fear, even emotional numbness. It's the mind's way of shedding its old form. And this isn't failure. It's architecture. You are meant to fall apart. The gods never promise clarity first. They promise transformation. There's a story told by a German transpersonal therapist in a lecture archived by the International Transpersonal Association. One of her clients, a spiritual seeker, reported recurring dreams of temples with shifting hallways and doors that vanished behind her. Every time she thought she'd reach the center, it would collapse. She entered therapy believing she was regressing, but the therapist told her, "You're not going backward. You're circling closer." Months later, the dream stopped, replaced by a stillness she had never known. The danger isn't in getting lost. It's in believing the confusion means something is wrong. Thoth's labyrinth is not a trap, it's a filter. It sorts those who seek power from those who seek truth, because only those willing to be broken by the path will reach its center intact. And when that moment comes, there is no map. Only intuition, only presence, only silence. And in that silence, a strange thing begins to happen. Time bends, certainty dissolves. The mind stops asking, "Where am I?" and starts hearing a new question rise from within. Who is walking? The labyrinth becomes more than a place. It becomes a mirror. And every wrong turn was never wrong. It was perfectly placed. But just when you feel the center is near, the walls shift again, and you realize it was never about reaching the center, but who you become on the way to it. You were taught to chase, to strive, accumulate, control. In life, in work, even in spirituality. But the Book of Thoth offers a paradox so disarming it almost feels like a warning. The path to godhood doesn't begin with power, it begins with surrender. In its quietest passages, it says that what must first die is not the body, nor desire, but the idea that you need to become anything at all. One line, half buried in a verse of Tablet 12, reads, "Only the hollow may hold the infinite." It's easily overlooked, but initiates say this is one of the core truths hidden in plain sight. Before the fire rises, before the gates open, before the name is remembered, there is an emptiness, a silence so complete that the self begins to dissolve into something vast. And in that vastness, the illusion of separation begins to burn away. In philosophy, this concept echoes through the writings of Meister Eckhart, who wrote, "God is not attained by thinking about God, but by becoming nothing." And in neuroscience, researchers studying deep meditative states have observed a curious pattern. When the brain activity tied to self-referencing slows down, people report feelings of vastness, timelessness, and unity with all things. The self disappears, but what appears in its place? is something far greater. One powerful example comes from a former Wall Street investor who shared his story in an interview on the Modern Mystics podcast. After years of spiritual seeking, high-performance coaching, and esoteric study, he reached a breaking point. He gave everything up: his job, his identity, his chase for awakening. Alone in a cabin, for months, he meditated with no method, no goal. He described one night where, in total stillness, he felt himself vanish. No thoughts, no memory, only presence. And in that moment, he said, "I didn't become God. I realized I had never been anything else." This is the danger of letting go. It feels like death. The structures of identity tremble. The stories you tell yourself begin to collapse. The ego tries to negotiate, to reclaim meaning. But the deeper you release, the more silence reveals its true nature. Not absence, but fullness. And from that fullness, something begins to take shape that no technique can create. A knowing without thought. A presence beyond emotion. And that's the truth most won't dare to accept. That the door to divine power doesn't open by pushing harder. It opens when you stop trying to open it. When you stop reaching outward and allow the structure of striving to fall apart. Because once it does, you stop becoming and start remembering. Remembering the part of you that was never seeking. The part that already knows. But that knowing doesn't come as light. It comes as a void that doesn't echo your voice back. And it's only in that terrifying silence that the real voice finally speaks. You've been conditioned to believe that language begins with words. That meaning comes through letters, sentences, logic. But the Book of Thoth doesn't speak to the mind. It speaks to the inner eye. It was never meant to be read like a story. It was meant to be seen through symbols that bypass thought and strike directly into consciousness. And when they do, something ancient stirs. Egyptian glyphs were never just pictures. They were charged images, each one a bridge between the physical and the unseen. A single symbol carried emotional, energetic, and cosmological meaning. When Thoth wrote, he encoded not concepts but frequencies, shaping perception like a sculptor molds clay. In fact, modern research in semiotics, the science of signs, shows that symbolic imagery impacts the brain more rapidly and deeply than verbal language. You don't interpret a symbol, you absorb it. Neuroscientists at MIT have discovered that visual data travels faster and reaches more regions of the brain than auditory input. This might explain why ancient civilizations used symbols in sacred texts, rituals, and even architecture, not to decorate, but to activate. And the Book of Thoth, with its geometric alignments and layered images, appears less like scripture and more like software. Except instead of running on machines, it runs through your nervous system. A French woman, featured on a small but revealing YouTube channel called Voix Alchimique, shared her experience after studying the symbolic sequences found in versions of the book linked to tarot. She wasn't spiritual, just curious. But after weeks of drawing and meditating on the symbols, she began experiencing vivid dreams of temples, voices, and strange mathematical patterns she had no prior knowledge of. It was like something was communicating through me, she said. Not in words, in pulses, images, patterns of feeling. What if that's what symbols were always meant to be? Not representations of meaning, but transmitters of it. Not telling you something, but unlocking something you already know, stored deep within a part of you modern life has kept asleep. And when these images begin to stir that part awake, you don't learn something new. You recognize something you've always known, but had no language for. And then something strange happens. The world around you begins to mirror the symbols you've internalized. A hawk flies overhead during meditation. A stranger utters a phrase you just read the night before. The inner and the outer start to sync, as if reality itself is now responding to your symbolic awareness. Not because it changed, but because you did. But it's in that moment when symbol becomes mirror that you start to wonder, if these ancient images hold that kind of power, what else have I been seeing all my life without ever truly decoding it? Imagine staring into your own eyes, not to fix your appearance, but to see what lives behind it. Not just your thoughts, not just your emotions, but your origin. The Book of Thoth speaks of a mirror, not made of glass, but of awareness, a tool used not for reflection, but for revelation. And those who've practiced what it describes claim that it doesn't show you who you are, it shows you what you've been carrying. In ancient Egyptian initiation rites, there was a practice few dare speak of today, the ritual of the mirror. The initiate was led to a still surface, water, obsidian, polished bronze, and instructed to hold the gaze not until something appeared, but until something disappeared. The face, the name, the mask, and in its place, a presence older than memory began to look back. Thoth called this the witness within the lightless light. It was never meant to be understood, only recognized. In psychology, this technique resembles what Carl Jung called active imagination, using a visualized image, often your own reflection, to trigger unconscious material. Studies in therapeutic settings show that mirror gazing can induce altered states of consciousness, heightened emotional awareness, and in some cases, visionary experiences. The brain, when deprived of stimulus variety and forced into deep focus, begins to access latent inner archetypes, and something buried begins to rise. One deeply striking account comes from a California-based clinical report from 2015, where a patient suffering from severe emotional repression engaged in prolonged mirror therapy combined with breath regulation. Over time, he began speaking aloud in voices he didn't recognize, one of which identified itself as his hidden child. He later stated, "I didn't feel possessed. I felt seen. For the first time, I wasn't performing a self. I was listening to one I forgot existed." Thoth's version of this wasn't just self-inquiry, it was self-collapse. The ritual wasn't meant to heal the ego, but to strip it. The longer you look, the more the identity you were starts to waver. It feels like dissolving, like becoming transparent. But in that absence, a clarity rises. Not mental clarity, soul clarity. The part of you untouched by time, by trauma, by biography. A gaze not toward something, but from something. And it's in this liminal space that many seekers report a moment of recognition. A shiver, a tear, a sudden laugh or silence so complete, it feels like a second heartbeat. The realization that you were never trying to become spiritual. You were trying to remember the one inside you, who never forgot. But when the mirror becomes still, and the eyes staring back no longer seem like yours, you must ask the one question no one dares to say aloud. If this is not me looking, then who is? They told you death is the end, that it is something to fear, resist, avoid. But in the Book of Thoth, death is never treated as an enemy, it's the threshold. A sacred crossing, not into nothingness, but into remembrance. In these ancient lines, Thoth describes death not as a termination of life, but as the moment when the illusion of life is peeled away, and what's left is what's always been eternal. In Tablet 7, there's a passage where Thoth speaks of walking in shadow while holding the light. He's not referring to physical death, he's describing initiation, the controlled encounter with one's own mortality while still alive. This echoes across traditions. In Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo Thodol, known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is not read after death, but before, to train the mind for what it will face. The ancient Egyptians had the same belief, that to die consciously is to escape the endless cycles of forgetting. Modern science brushes against this idea through the study of near-death experiences. Dr. Raymond Moody, a pioneer in the field, documented thousands of accounts where people clinically died, then returned. Most describe seeing their entire lives in a flash, feeling weightless, or encountering beings of light that communicated without words. But many also returned with a strange shift, no longer afraid of death, because they felt they had passed through it and come back different. On the Brazilian YouTube channel Morte Lucida, a man shared his story after a motorcycle accident that left him clinically dead for 3 minutes. In those minutes, he said time stopped. His body fell away, and in the space where fear should have been, there was only recognition. He said, "I didn't go anywhere. I remembered where I had always been. And when I came back, everything I feared had lost its voice." It wasn't comfort. It was clarity. And this is what the Book of Thoth prepares the initiate for: the rehearsal of death, not as drama, but as detachment. The deliberate shedding of identity, attachment, and memory. Some do this through silence, others through deep trance, dark retreats, or breath work. But the goal is the same: to meet the dissolution of self before the body dies, so that when it does, nothing important is lost. Because once you pass through that threshold and return, you don't live the same way. You stop running from endings, you stop craving permanence, and you begin to feel something shift in your perception. Not less fear, but less self. A spaciousness opens inside, and within it, a new kind of listening begins. But what if the final initiation wasn't about preparing for death? What if it was about realizing you've already died before, and that everything you call life is only the remembering of how to wake up? They call it the third eye, a mystical window, a spiritual radar. But what if this eye doesn't just see energy? What if it receives it? In the Book of Thoth, there are no direct diagrams of anatomy, but buried in the verses are phrases that echo a precise structure, a chamber of fire between the eyes, silent, watching, eternal. Modern mystics and neuroscientists alike point to the same structure, the pineal gland. Deep in the center of your brain lies a tiny organ, shaped like a pine cone, long venerated in Egyptian, Hindu, and even Roman symbolism. In modern biology, it regulates melatonin, your sleep hormone. But Thoth's description of the gate through which flame becomes vision matches too closely with traditions that treat this gland as something more than physical. Some say it's a lens, others call it an antenna, but all agree it's not dormant, it's waiting. In the 2010 documentary, The Spirit Molecule, researchers explored the effects of DMT, a compound naturally produced in small amounts by the pineal gland. Subjects reported entering otherworldly realms, encountering intelligent beings, and experiencing time loss. These were not hallucinations in the chaotic sense. They were structured, vivid, coherent, and many describe the sense of being remembered by something beyond the body. It's as if the gland isn't creating images, it's tuning in. There's a testimony from a man in India who underwent 21 days of silence and sensory fasting, a process rooted in ancient yogic practices said to activate the third eye. After 2 weeks, he began to perceive light while his eyes were closed, not visualized light, but something he described as a pressure of vision. No shapes, no images, just a knowing that he was being observed from inside. He said, it felt like the eye was not opening, it was waking up. And here lies the hidden danger. In the Book of Thoth, it said that when this eye fully activates, you do not look out, you are looked into. This is where the illusion of control falls away. The being you think of as you becomes transparent. And what begins to gaze through this internal lens may not be the ego at all. It might be the soul, or something older, deeper, watching you return to a vision it never forgot. Modern research has begun to explore how stimulation of this gland, through sound frequencies, breath control, or darkness meditation, can alter consciousness, emotional states, and even immune response. But what no lab can yet measure is what happens when the visions stop being symbolic and begin to respond to you. Because once the third eye is truly open, you stop seeing signs, you start being seen by them, and that gaze never looks away. There's a line at the end of the Book of Thoth that's never spoken aloud. Not because it's missing, but because those who found it chose not to translate it. Some say it was an error. Others say it was indecipherable. But in certain private circles, among occultists, linguists, and esoteric scholars, it's whispered that this final passage contains a choice. One that doesn't just alter your path, but splits it. Ancient scrolls attributed to Thoth speak of the last voice, a phrase some interpret as metaphor. But in multiple closed-door teachings of the Rosicrucians and the Golden Dawn, it's treated quite literally. This voice, they say, emerges only once. When the initiate has crossed every gate, silenced every identity, and reached a state where nothing more can be added. Only then does the final line make itself known. Not through language, but through knowing. One Arabic-speaking linguist, interviewed anonymously on a Cairo livestream and later quoted on a niche occult forum, claimed to have seen a papyrus fragment believed to contain this line. According to him, it didn't read like a sentence. It looked like a split key, a structure of mirror glyphs that didn't translate into words, but into decisions. It wasn't knowledge, he said. It was a demand. It asked me to choose between the world I know and the one I couldn't return from. The Book of Thoth was never about answers. It was a threshold, and those who reach the end aren't rewarded with light, clarity, or divine status. They are faced with something stranger, the choice to step out of the loop of incarnation or to re-enter it with total memory. One path leads to stillness beyond time, the other to a life fully conscious within the illusion. Neither is safe, neither is neutral, and both demand that you leave behind everything familiar, including your own name. And this is why so many turn back, because the final code doesn't promise bliss. It promises responsibility. It hands you the awareness that you are not just a seeker, but a source. And once you know that, you can never again pretend you're a victim of your story. You're its author, its architect, its witness, and that truth carries a weight heavier than most can bear. But those who do change. Their presence deepens. Their voice slows. Their eyes no longer seek, they see. Not with intensity, but with recognition. Like someone who's already read the end of the book and chose to write another chapter anyway. And that's the code no one wants to admit exists. Because if it does, then this isn't life. It's a conversation you began long before birth. And now, you're hearing your own voice call you back.